In the medieval world, warfare was a constant presence, shaping kingdoms, influencing politics, and defining personal destinies. For many, military service wasn't just an obligation or a matter of survival, it was one of the few available paths to advancement in a deeply hierarchical society. While war carried enormous risks, it also promised rewards that reached far beyond the battlefield. From the poorest foot soldier to the landless knight, men joined armies not only to serve their lords but to seize opportunities, whether that meant gold, land, honor, spiritual redemption, or a legacy that could outlive them. To understand medieval warfare fully, we have to look beyond the battles themselves and ask, what did these soldiers fight for, and what could they truly gain? Number 1. Fighting for a reason. In the medieval world, where life for most people was shaped by rigid hierarchies, predictable roles, and inherited obligations, military service stood out as a rare opportunity to escape one's place and possibly gain something more. Unlike modern warfare, which often carries national or ideological motives, medieval war was deeply personal, tied to land, loyalty, inheritance, survival, and ambition. Soldiers didn't fight out of patriotism in the modern sense. They fought for what they could earn, for whom they owed allegiance to, or simply for the chance to change their fortunes. For many, especially those at the bottom of society, picking up a spear or bow meant stepping into a brutal but potentially transformative space. Contrary to popular depictions focused entirely on chivalrous knights in polished armor, the reality of medieval armies was far more layered. The majority of forces were made up of peasants, yeomen, laborers, craftsmen. Ordinary people whose everyday lives involved hard physical work with little reward. Some were summoned through feudal obligation, especially in the early Middle Ages, while others volunteered, often because military campaigns promised more food, pay, and perhaps a share of loot. In regions where local lords needed to raise private armies quickly, contracts or promises of rewards were commonly used to recruit men. These promises varied: cash, clothes, food, or in some cases, freedom from certain taxes. For those already living at the margins, that could be enough. At the same time, military service wasn't just a route for survival, it was also one of the few ways to gain visibility and agency. For the younger sons of noble families who stood to inherit nothing due to primogeniture, fighting in campaigns was sometimes the only respectable path forward. The sword became a tool of both violence and ambition. If they proved themselves on the battlefield, demonstrated leadership, courage, or tactical brilliance, they could win favor with higher lords or even the monarch. Service might earn them a command, a fief, or a place in a royal retinue. Some even married into wealth or received lands seized from rebels or conquered foes. And for knights, warfare was practically a profession. From childhood, they were trained in combat, horsemanship, discipline, and feudal duty. War was a place to fulfill their expected role as protectors and enforcers of noble power. But it was also more than duty. It was an arena for advancement. A knight who distinguished himself might rise quickly, not necessarily in noble rank, but in social clout and influence. Tournaments offered glory in peacetime, but real prestige came from battlefield exploits. Word of heroic deeds could travel fast, opening doors at court or winning patronage. Warfare wasn't just about who you fought. It was also about who noticed. The logic of war in the medieval era was shaped by both necessity and opportunity. Monarchs and lords needed bodies to enforce their will, expand their borders, or defend their holdings. In return, those who served expected something back. That mutual expectation made military service transactional, and for many, a calculated gamble. The risk of death was high, but so was the risk of dying poor, unknown, and powerless if they did nothing. The battlefield gave men, poor or titled, a narrow but real chance to shift the path of their lives. Number 2, pay and plunder. In the structure of medieval warfare, the promise of financial reward was a powerful motivator, but receiving pay was rarely straightforward. Payment systems varied depending on time, region, and who was leading the campaign. Some soldiers fought out of feudal obligation, but professional fighters, such as longbowmen in England or mercenary companies in Italy, expected direct compensation. Wages were often arranged per day or per campaign, and the sums differed according to skill and role. A mounted knight might expect several shillings a day, while a foot soldier might earn mere pennies. Despite the formal arrangements, delays in payment were common, especially during long campaigns when royal treasuries ran dry or tax collection slowed. Still, the prospect of any form of regular income was attractive in a world where many lived close to subsistence. Soldiers knew they might never see all the coin they were promised, which is why plunder became such a central and expected part of military service. Looting wasn't just tolerated, it was often written into the informal code of war. Once an enemy stronghold fell, whether it was a castle, town, or camp, the conquering force claimed the spoils. There was little regulation, especially for common soldiers. What they could seize and carry was theirs, and this included money, food, horses, tools, and clothing. For many, a single siege could offer more value than months of wage promises. Entire families sometimes relied on what a soldier could bring back after a campaign. Commanders usually tried to control looting to prevent chaos and preserve discipline, but they also knew it kept morale high. Plunder wasn't random violence. It was, in many campaigns, the real reward structure for the lower ranks. In sieges or raids, leaders often declared a set time for looting, sometimes 1 day, sometimes 3. After that, soldiers were expected to stop. Of course, this wasn't always obeyed, especially when discipline broke down after particularly bloody battles. For the knightly class, rewards took a more structured but lucrative form. Capturing enemy knights, lords, or even well-equipped squires presented opportunities for ransom. A noble prisoner wasn't just a source of income, it was a ticket to favor, influence, and further opportunity. Knights could demand large sums for their captives, often enough to cover years of expenses or even purchase land. Ransoming was so widespread that rules and customs developed around it, forming a sort of battlefield etiquette. In major wars like the 100 Years' War, capturing someone of rank could instantly change a knight's fortunes. Even beyond ransom, spoils for the elite were substantial. Horses, fine armor, embroidered surcoats, jeweled weapons. Items looted from fallen nobles or abandoned manors could fetch high prices or be kept as personal status symbols. A knight's equipment was expensive, and capturing quality gear from an enemy was one of the most practical gains of battle. The structure of reward through pay and plunder created a layered motivation system. Poorer men might fight for coin or basic goods, while knights aimed for strategic captures and battlefield glory. But at every level, the chance to profit from violence was part of what kept armies moving forward. Medieval war wasn't just a matter of loyalty or duty. It was an economy driven by risk, reward, and survival. Number 3, land and titles. In the medieval world, the most transformative reward for military service wasn't silver coins or plunder, it was land. Land in the Middle Ages wasn't just a resource, it was the foundation of authority, social standing, and political influence. It provided income, commanded loyalty, and anchored a man's position in the feudal hierarchy. For knights and commanders who offered long-term, loyal, and effective service, especially in major military campaigns, receiving land was a life-altering outcome that went far beyond personal enrichment. It was a reward that extended into future generations, often elevating entire families from obscurity to prominence. Medieval monarchs understood this system well. They couldn't always afford to pay their troops regularly in hard currency, especially during drawn-out wars like the 100 Years' War or during the Crusades, where maintaining an army required long-term logistical support. What they could offer instead was territory, either newly conquered regions or confiscated lands stripped from rebels or disloyal barons. These grants of land were not random gifts. They were carefully calculated decisions that strengthened the crown's control by planting trusted military leaders in strategic areas. In return for their estates, these new lords were expected to provide military support when called upon, manage local governance, and secure the king's interests in contested regions. When a knight received land, he didn't just gain the right to farm it. He took on the role of local lord. That meant collecting taxes, maintaining order, enforcing justice, and raising troops in times of war. He could build fortified structures like keeps or castles, and he might be responsible for the protection of nearby villages or trade routes. This transfer of power was not ceremonial, it redefined a man's role in society. With land came the right to bear a noble title, and with that title came both prestige and a voice in political matters. A knight who had proven himself on the battlefield could, through land grants, rise to become a baron, count, or earl, and potentially gain a seat at the royal council or parliament, depending on the region. These opportunities weren't limited to the heartlands of France or England. The Crusades opened vast new arenas for territorial reward. Crusader states in the Levant, such as the Kingdom of Jerusalem, were carved up and distributed among Western nobles who had taken part in the campaigns. Many of them ruled as independent princes in these newly created feudal states, establishing castles and holding territories that rivaled those of their homelands. Similar patterns appeared in Ireland, where Anglo-Norman knights were granted land after the conquest, and in the Baltic region during the Northern Crusades, where military orders like the Teutonic Knights distributed land to loyal commanders. These land grants reshaped the political map. Victory in battle wasn't just about defeating enemies, it was about redistributing power. As land changed hands, so did influence. Those who were once low-ranking knights could become regional powers in just a few years. And for monarchs, rewarding military service with land meant binding these new lords to the crown, ensuring future loyalty and reinforcing the feudal order. The battlefield, in this sense, wasn't only a place of violence. It was a space where the lines of property, authority, and class were redrawn. For those with the skill and luck to survive, land wasn't just a reward, it was a gateway to legacy, status, and real political weight. Number 4, glory and status. In medieval society, where the structure of life was dominated by birthright, inherited titles, and a rigid social hierarchy, the battlefield was one of the few places where reputation could reshape a man's identity. Unlike wealth, which was often concentrated and static, glory was fluid. It could be earned, witnessed, and remembered. Military campaigns weren't only about winning wars or capturing territory. They were arenas where individual acts of courage, leadership, and skill could elevate a man's status far beyond his original station. For knights, whose very identity was bound to ideals of honor and bravery, glory wasn't an abstract concept. It was a tangible asset that could open doors at court, solidify alliances, and grant political influence. A knight's reputation was meticulously built through both wartime valor and ceremonial acts during tournaments. These mock battles allowed warriors to showcase their martial prowess, but real fame came from surviving brutal engagements, making tactical breakthroughs, or defending positions against overwhelming odds. Success on the battlefield was witnessed not only by comrades but also by heralds and chroniclers who recorded deeds for nobles and monarchs. A well-known knight might be invited to a king's court, consulted on matters of war, or rewarded with a marriage alliance into a prestigious family. These opportunities weren't symbolic. They brought land, power, and a say in regional or national politics. Symbols like banners and coats of arms played a crucial role in broadcasting this status. They were carefully designed to reflect a knight's lineage, but also his accomplishments. These emblems traveled with him into battle, into tournaments, and into halls where political decisions were made. Among commanders, battlefield success could define an entire career. Generals who led decisive campaigns became not just military leaders but power brokers within the realm. Their influence extended beyond war, shaping laws, advising rulers, or acting as regents. Though rarer, even common-born soldiers had a path to recognition. Archers, pikemen, or sergeants who performed with extraordinary bravery were sometimes granted knighthood. This wasn't simply a reward, it was a reclassification. A man who had been anonymous in society could, through combat, earn respect and position that would have otherwise been impossible. While birth still mattered, glory had the rare ability to override it. And in a world obsessed with lineage and name, becoming a legend through war was one of the few ways to permanently alter the way others saw you and how you saw yourself. Number 5, faith and forgiveness. In the medieval worldview, the boundary between earthly conflict and spiritual struggle was porous, often indistinguishable. War wasn't just a matter of politics or power, it was intimately tied to religion, and for many, to the fate of their soul. Military service during the Middle Ages, especially during the era of the Crusades, carried with it the potential for spiritual reward, something that could not be earned through money or inheritance. The Church, understanding the psychological and emotional weight of eternal salvation, strategically used this to encourage participation in armed campaigns that aligned with its interests. Fighting in a holy war wasn't framed as violence. It was portrayed as penance, as a pilgrimage with a sword instead of a staff. The promise of indulgences, formal forgiveness granted by the Church for one's sins, became one of the most powerful incentives for joining crusading expeditions. Papal declarations assured knights and common soldiers alike that their participation in these sanctioned wars would not only cleanse them of past transgressions, but might even secure immediate passage to heaven if they died in battle. This was no small matter. The fear of purgatory and damnation loomed large in medieval Christian consciousness, and the Church's offer of a direct route to salvation through military service was a compelling, even irresistible proposition. This spiritual reward wasn't limited to the campaigns in the Holy Land. Internal religious conflicts such as the Albigensian Crusade in southern France or wars against pagan groups in the Baltic were granted similar status by the papacy. Soldiers could earn the same divine benefits for rooting out heresy or converting non-Christians, which blurred the lines between religious duty and political ambition. Monarchs benefited from these incentives as well, since framing their military objectives as holy missions gave legitimacy to territorial expansion or civil suppression. For knights trained in violence and bound by codes of honor and chivalry, the idea that their professional skills could be redirected toward divine service elevated their actions from brutal necessity to spiritual vocation. Religious symbols were sewn onto their surcoats, and mass was conducted before battles not just as ritual, but as a preparation for martyrdom. Dying in battle for the faith was, in many ways, seen as the ultimate sacrifice, one that erased sins and elevated a man's legacy beyond his deeds on earth. The Church didn't merely tolerate war, in many cases it orchestrated, directed, and sanctified it. By fusing religious ideology with military structure, it created a unique motivation system that was as much about belief as it was about gain. Faith transformed war into something larger than conquest. It became an act of devotion, an offering, a path not only to honor, but to absolution. And for a society obsessed with the afterlife, that was perhaps the most powerful reward of all. Number 6, brotherhood, connection, and legacy. Beyond money, land, and recognition, one of the most overlooked yet deeply meaningful rewards of medieval military service was the enduring sense of fraternity and shared identity that formed among soldiers. The brutal conditions of campaign life, the chaos of siege warfare, and the high stakes of battle naturally bound men together in ways that few other medieval experiences could. Whether you were a low-born archer sleeping in the mud or a mounted knight sharing wine in a campaign tent, the men beside you became more than comrades. They became brothers. These relationships, forged in fire and fear, often lasted long after the fighting stopped. War created a kind of social glue that ignored some of the usual class divides, at least temporarily. A squire might save his knight's life in a night ambush. A foot soldier might hold a shield wall that protected nobles, and those moments mattered. Lords didn't forget who stood firm in the shield line, who broke the enemy ranks, or who dragged them out of a burning keep. After the campaign, these experiences turned into bonds of trust, loyalty, and obligation. Veterans often returned home with new roles waiting, sometimes as household retainers, estate bailiffs, or even business partners, depending on who they had impressed in the field. In noble circles, battlefield alliances shaped political futures. A knight who had stood shoulder to shoulder with a duke or prince could find himself pulled into court affairs or offered a strategic marriage. Entire generations of landed families in England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire owed their rise not to blood alone but to wartime connections. These relationships weren't just useful, they were part of a growing network of loyalty that reinforced the feudal structure from within. Then came the matter of legacy. In a world where few people left written records or monuments, surviving battle or dying honorably was one of the few ways a person's name might live on. Families passed down war stories like heirlooms. A dented helm or a battered sword wasn't junk, it was memory. Songs were sung about brave charges or narrow escapes, and sometimes those tales were recorded by chroniclers or monks, especially if the soldier's deeds were tied to a noble cause or famous battle. Even anonymous acts could become local legend, giving a soldier's descendants something to take pride in. For many, the battlefield offered not just a chance to earn something, but to mean something. To belong to a story greater than themselves. To forge a legacy in an age where memory was rare and names were quickly lost to time. In that sense, brotherhood and legacy weren't just rewards of war. They were, for some, the only rewards that truly lasted.